The restaurant was the kind of place where the lights were always dimmed just enough to make everyone look mysterious, and the music played softly in the background so you had to lean in to hear the person across from you. It was known around the city as the Palace, not because it was huge, but because it was exclusive. Getting a table here was harder than getting tickets to a concert. Every night the place was filled with people wearing expensive watches and shiny shoes, clinking glasses of wine that cost more than what most people made in a week. Working there was a young man who had been a server for 5 years. He was good at his job, really good. He knew exactly which fork to use for the salad and how to pour wine without spilling a single drop. But over the years he had started to feel like he owned the place. He had developed a talent for sizing people up the moment they walked through the heavy oak doors. In his mind, customers were divided into two simple groups: the ones who would tip big, and the ones who were just wasting his time. It was a busy Tuesday evening, and the air inside smelled like truffle oil and money. The server was moving smoothly between tables, flashing his best smile at a group of men in sharp suits who were ordering bottles of champagne. He was laughing at their jokes, making sure they felt like kings. He knew that table alone would pay his rent for the month. Just then, the front door opened. The cool night air blew in for a second before the door shut again. A man walked in. He didn't have a reservation, which was rare for this place. He stood by the entrance for a moment, looking around. He was wearing a faded black hoodie that looked like it had seen better days, loose jeans, and a well-worn pair of boots. On his head, he pulled a baseball cap low, almost covering his eyes. He had a day's worth of stubble on his face, and he looked incredibly tired, like he hadn't slept in days. The server watched him from across the room. He didn't even try to hide the look of annoyance that crossed his face. To him, this man didn't belong. He didn't look like a celebrity, and he certainly didn't look like a businessman. He looked like someone who had wandered in off the street, looking for a bathroom or a glass of water. The man walked up to the host stand. The host looked confused, flipping through his book. The server watched the interaction closely, shaking his head slightly. He saw the man point to a small, empty table in the quietest, darkest corner of the restaurant, the table right, next to the kitchen entrance where the waiters were always rushing in and out with hot food. It was the worst seat in the house. Usually that table was empty or used for extra storage. The host nodded and led the man to that corner seat. The server watched them go, feeling a pang of irritation. He couldn't believe it. On a night this busy, they were going to waste a table on this guy? The server turned his back on them. He had decided right then and there that he wasn't going to waste his energy on this guest. There were investors at table 4 and a first date at table 7 who actually needed his attention. The guy in the corner could wait. 10 minutes went by. The server was busy describing the specials to the men in suits, making sure their water glasses were never empty. He was in his element, enjoying the feeling of being important. Every time he passed the corner table, he deliberately looked the other way. He saw the man sitting there, patiently waiting. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't tapping his fingers impatiently. He was just sitting quietly, looking at the menu with his hands folded in his lap. Finally, the server had a moment to breathe. He sighed, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked over toward the dark corner. He knew he couldn't ignore the guy forever, or the manager would get on his case. But he wasn't going to be nice about it. In his mind, this man was taking up space that could have been used by a real customer. He decided he would be quick, he would be rude, and maybe the man would get the hint and leave. He walked over to the table, his footsteps heavy on the carpet. He didn't bring a notepad. He didn't bring a smile. He stood over the table, looking down at the man with a cold stare. The man looked up from his menu. His eyes were kind, but they looked tired. He gave a small, polite nod, ready to order. But the server wasn't interested in being polite. The air around the table felt heavy, the noise of the restaurant fading away as the server prepared to say something he shouldn't. The silence stretched for a second too long, setting the stage for a mistake that would change everything. 20 minutes had drifted by, and in a restaurant this busy that was a lifetime. The dining room was alive with the sound of silverware clinking against fine china, and the low hum of dozens of conversations. But in that dark corner it was dead silent. The man in the worn-out hoodie hadn't complained. He hadn't waved his arm or shouted for service. He just sat there, his hands resting on the table, calmly watching the flow of the room. The waiter, on the other hand, was working up a sweat. He was darting back and forth between the kitchen and the table of loud investors, making sure their champagne glasses were never less than half full. Every time he passed the corner table, he felt a spark of annoyance. Why didn't the guy just leave? The waiter was convinced the man was just wasting space, maybe hoping to get a free glass of water before moving on. He decided that if he ignored the problem long enough, it would go away. Finally, the rush at the bar slowed down for a moment. The waiter realized he couldn't avoid the corner table any longer. The manager was giving him a look from across the room, a subtle nod that meant, "Take care of it." The waiter let out a loud, dramatic sigh, wiping his hands on his apron. He grabbed a menu, not because he thought the man needed one, but just to look busy as he marched over. He didn't walk over with the intention of being helpful. He walked over like he was approaching a stray dog that had wandered into a private party. He stood at the edge of the small table, looming over the seated guest. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't say his name. He just stood there, tapping his pen against the order pad with an impatient rhythm. "So, are you ready to order something?" the waiter asked, his voice cold and sharp. He didn't hide the fact that he was in a hurry. "Or are you just going to keep taking up space?" The man in the cap looked up. His eyes were gentle, but there was a deep exhaustion in them. He didn't seem offended by the rudeness. He just nodded politely. "Yes, thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "Could I please have the chicken pasta? And just a glass of tap water, please." "No ice." The waiter stared at him. He let out a short, mocking laugh. He leaned down, putting his hands on the table, invading the man's personal space. "The chicken pasta? Do you know how much that costs?" "It's $45. He said the price slowly, emphasizing every word as if explaining math to a child. "This isn't a roadside diner, pal. We don't do cheap meals here." The guest blinked, surprised by the hostility. "I understand," he said softly. "I can pay for it." The waiter wasn't listening. He had sized the man up the second he walked in, and he had already made up his mind. This guy with his ripped jeans and old jacket probably didn't have $45 to his name. In the waiter's mind, he was doing the restaurant a favor by scaring this cheap customer away before he ate the food and realized he couldn't pay the bill. "Look," the waiter said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He looked around to make sure the rich guests weren't listening, then leaned in closer. "Do yourself a favor. Walk out that door, turn left, and go to the burger joint 3 blocks down. They have a $1 menu." "That seems more like your speed." The man in the cap didn't move. He didn't get angry. He just looked at the waiter with a calmness that was almost unsettling. It was the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot in life, from not letting small things bother you anymore. "I just wanted to have a quiet dinner," the man repeated. "I've heard good things about this place." "Yeah, well, this place is for people who contribute," the waiter snapped, feeling a surge of boldness. He didn't care if he was being mean. He felt superior. He felt like the guardian of the restaurant's class. "I don't have time to waste on someone who's going to leave me a $2 tip. If you're not going to order the steak and a bottle of wine, you're wasting my table." He reached out and snatched the menu out of the man's hand. "Don't waste my time," he said, turning on his heel. "Order properly or go." The silence at the table was heavy. The waiter walked away, feeling a strange sense of pride. He felt like he had won a battle. He had protected the restaurant from someone who didn't deserve to be there. He went back to the table of investors, pouring them more wine with a bright smile, completely unaware of the storm he had just created. He didn't look back at the corner. If he had, he would have seen the man slowly standing up, the sadness in his eyes deepening, as he prepared to leave the money he had on the table for a meal he never received. The silence that followed the waiter's harsh words was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. For a split second, The clatter of silverware and the loud laughter from the bar seemed to fade into the background. The people sitting at the tables nearby had heard the rude comment about the burger joint. They stopped eating and glanced over, whispering to each other. It was awkward for everyone, but the waiter didn't care. He stood there with his chest puffed out, feeling a strange sense of pride, like he had just protected the restaurant from an intruder. The man in the baseball cap didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He didn't call for the manager. He just looked down at the table for a moment, his face unreadable under the shadow of his hat brim. It was the kind of look someone gives when they are used to being misunderstood. A look of deep patience that comes from years of dealing with the world's chaos. The waiter, however, wasn't satisfied with just winning the argument verbally. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to prove that he was in charge. He turned and marched over to the side station where the fresh bread was kept in a woven basket. He grabbed a few rolls, not gently, but aggressively, and then grabbed a small dish of butter. Instead of placing them on the table like a normal server would, he walked back to the corner and slammed the basket down. The plates rattled, and a few crumbs scattered across the clean white tablecloth. "Here?" the waiter snapped, his voice loud enough for the entire section to hear. "Since you're so hungry, this is on the house, but don't get used to it. We aren't a charity." He leaned in closer, invading the guest's personal space again. His eyes were narrow, his jaw clenched tight. "And let me give you a piece of advice. When you walk out of here, don't even think about stiffing me on the tip. I know your type. You come in here, looking like a mess, act like you own the place, and then leave nothing? Save your pennies for the bus ride home, pal." The insult hung in the air, ugly and unnecessary. A few of the wealthy guests at the nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman even put her hand over her mouth, shocked by the waiter's behavior. But the waiter was too focused on his own anger to notice the room turning against him. He felt powerful in that moment. Looking down at a man he assumed was poor and helpless. The man in the cap slowly closed the book he had been reading. He placed his hand gently on top of the cover, treating the old book with care. Then he looked up. His eyes met the waiter's, and they weren't filled with the anger the waiter expected. Instead, they were filled with pity. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I feel sorry for you. You have a lot of anger inside you," the guest said softly. His voice was calm, steady, and carried a weight that made the waiter take a step back. "It must be exhausting to carry that around all day. I hope you find some peace." The words hit the waiter harder than any shout could have. For a second he felt a flush of embarrassment, but he pushed it down quickly, replacing it with more aggression. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Save the philosophy for someone who cares." The guest sighed, a quiet sound of resignation. He reached into the pocket of his worn jeans and pulled out a few crumpled bills. They were $5 bills and $10 bills mixed together. He smoothed them out on the table with a hand that had worked hard in its life. He arranged them neatly next to the bread basket. It was enough to pay for the bread he hadn't eaten and a little extra. The guest stood up slowly. He wasn't tall, but he had a presence that commanded respect, even in his old clothes. He picked up his book and tucked it under his arm. He looked at the waiter one last time, gave a small, sad nod, and turned toward the door. He didn't storm off in a rage. He walked away with his head down, his shoulders slumped slightly, looking like a man who just wanted to disappear. As he walked through the dining room, the atmosphere felt strange. The waiter stood by the table, fuming. He looked down at the crumpled money. "Typical," he muttered to himself. "Cheap." He snatched up the cash, shoving it into his apron pocket. He felt he had won. He had driven the weirdo away. But as he watched the guest reach for the heavy oak door at the front of the restaurant, a strange feeling started to grow in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was just a feeling that something was off. The way the man had spoken, the way he hadn't fought back. It wasn't how most people reacted to being insulted. Most people would scream. Most people would ask to see the manager. This man had just wished him peace. The waiter brushed the thought away. He turned his back on the door and headed toward the kitchen to clear his head. He didn't know that the manager had been standing by the bar, watching the entire scene unfold. He didn't know that she was already rushing over with a look of pure horror on her face. He just grabbed a glass of water, drank it quickly, and prepared to go back to work. Thinking the worst of his night was over, he was wrong. The worst of his night was just beginning, and the man walking out that door was about to change his life forever. The crumpled bills in his pocket felt heavy, burning a hole in the fabric, as the bell above the door chimed for the last time, signaling the end of the stranger's visit. The waiter was still standing by the small corner table, wiping away the few crumbs the guest had left with a rag. He felt a mix of annoyance and satisfaction. He was glad the weirdo was gone, but he was still agitated by the interaction. He threw the dirty rag onto the table and grabbed the small dish of butter the man hadn't touched. As he turned to walk back toward the kitchen, the heavy oak front doors of the restaurant swung open violently. It wasn't a gentle entrance. A gust of cool night air rushed into the warm room, causing the candles on the tables to flicker wildly. The restaurant's maitre d', a tall man who was usually very calm and composed, came rushing in. He looked flustered, his tie slightly undone, and he was holding a clipboard like it was a shield. Right behind him, a film crew with cameras on their shoulders and equipment bags slung over their shoulders stumbled in, filling the entrance with chaos. The entire dining room went quiet. The men in suits stopped laughing. The waiters froze in their tracks. The waiter in the corner paused, watching the commotion with a frown. He wondered if a food critic had arrived or perhaps a pop star was hiding behind the cameras. The floor manager, a sharp woman who usually commanded respect with just a look, rushed out of the office. She looked terrified. She ran straight to the maitre d', her voice high and stressed. "Is he here? Has he arrived yet?" she asked, clutching her hands together. "The investors are waiting in the private room. They are getting impatient." The maitre d' looked around the bustling room, his eyes scanning every face. He checked his watch, sweating slightly. "He should be here," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "The text said he was walking over. He doesn't like to be late." The waiter in the corner rolled his eyes. "Great," he thought. "Another VIP who thinks the world revolves around them." He picked up the stack of dirty plates from the corner table and headed toward the kitchen, deciding to stay out of the way. He didn't care about celebrities or investors. He just wanted to finish his shift. "Wait," the maitre d' shouted, pointing toward the street visible through the glass doors. "I see him. He's walking away." The manager's head snapped toward the door. Her eyes widened in horror. "What? He was here? Inside?" She sounded like she couldn't believe it. The waiter stopped walking. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, balancing the dirty plates in his hands. He watched the scene unfold like a slow-motion movie. The manager and the maitre d' bolted for the door, practically knocking over a stand of flowers in their haste. They pushed the doors open and ran out onto the sidewalk. The waiter's heart began to beat a little faster. He looked at the empty corner table he had just cleared. He looked at the door. Then he looked back at the staff. The other waiters were whispering, pointing, and looking confused. The host girl who had seated the weirdo in the corner was standing by her stand, her face pale as a ghost. The manager came back inside a moment later, followed closely by the maitre d'. They weren't running now, but they looked serious. Very serious. They walked past the bar, past the confused investors, and stopped right in the middle of the floor. "Who served him?" the manager asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a knife. She was looking around the room, her eyes searching the faces of her staff. "Who served the man in the black hoodie?" The restaurant went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The waiters looked at each other, then looked down at their shoes. No one wanted to admit it. The waiter felt a cold chill run down his spine. He looked at the table he had just wiped down. He looked at the crumpled bills still sitting in his apron pocket. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his hand. I did," he stammered. But he wasn't a VIP, he was just a guy. He was dressed like a homeless person. He ordered tap water. I told him to leave. He tried to laugh nervously, to make a joke of it, but the sound died in his throat when he saw the manager's face. She didn't look angry. She looked devastated. She walked over to him, her steps slow and heavy. She stopped right in front of him, looking him dead in the eye. "That wasn't just a guy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "That was Mr. Reeves." The waiter blinked. He felt like he had been slapped. "Reeves? Who?" "Keanu Reeves," the maître d' said from behind her, crossing his arms. "The owner of this building. The man who paid for the renovation of this kitchen. The man who employs you." The waiter's knees went weak. He nearly dropped the stack of plates. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The blood drained from his face, leaving him feeling cold and dizzy. His mind started racing, replaying the last 20 minutes in fast forward, asterisk the faded hoodie. The quiet voice. "The patients." The palace, asterisk, he remembered saying, "Turn left and go to the burger joint." He remembered saying, "Save your pennies." He remembered slamming the breadbasket down. He had just insulted one of the nicest, most famous actors in the world in the man's own restaurant. He had told the owner that he didn't belong there. He left a tip, the waiter whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled wad of bills. It was maybe $15. To a billionaire it was nothing, but the waiter held it like it was burning his hand. The manager looked at the money, then up at the waiter. She didn't take it from him. "He is outside right now," she said quietly. "He didn't want to make a scene. He was incredibly polite when we stopped him. He didn't even tell on you. We had to beg him to come back in." The waiter looked toward the door. He saw the silhouette of the man standing on the sidewalk, talking quietly to the film crew who were now setting up their cameras. The man didn't look angry. He was just standing there, hands in his pockets, the same humble figure who had walked in alone. The waiter felt sick. He wanted to run out the back door. He wanted to hide in the freezer. He realized that while he was busy acting like he owned the place, he had just treated the actual owner like trash. The hierarchy he thought was so real had just been flipped upside down in the cruelest way possible. The palace wasn't his kingdom. It belonged to the man in the cap, and the waiter had just banished the king from his own castle. The waiter stood frozen in the middle of the fancy dining room. The stack of dirty plates in his hands felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he could hear a thumping sound in his ears. Through the glass windows of the restaurant, he could see the manager and the maître d' standing on the sidewalk with the man in the hoodie. The cold wind was blowing, but the famous actor didn't seem to mind. He was just listening to them apologize, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, inside. The waiter felt like the floor was about to open up and swallow him whole. The realization of what he had done washed over him like a cold wave. He had spent the last hour acting like he was the king of the castle, looking down on someone he thought was nobody. It turned out the person he insulted was the man who actually owned the castle. The irony was suffocating. He felt sick to his stomach. He wanted to run out the back door, go home, and hide under his blankets forever. He just wanted to disappear. The investors at the big table were looking at him now, whispering behind their menus. They knew, everyone knew. He could feel their eyes burning into him, but he didn't dare look back at them. He kept his eyes on the glass door, waiting for the shouting to start. He expected the actor to come storming back in, demanding to see the manager, pointing a finger at him, and getting him fired on the spot. That is what anyone else would have done. That is what he would have done if someone treated him that way. A few minutes later, the manager came back inside alone. The bell above the door chimed, breaking the heavy silence. She walked slowly, her face unreadable. The waiter braced himself. He gripped the edge of a table to steady his shaking hands. He was ready to hear, "You're fired." He knew he deserved it. He had humiliated a guest in front of a room full of people. She stopped in front of him and looked him up and down. She didn't look angry, which surprised him. She looked disappointed. There is a big difference between anger and disappointment hurts much more. "Do you realize what you just did?" she asked him, keeping her voice low so the other guests couldn't hear. The waiter nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt tight. That was Keanu Reeves, she said, her voice serious. Not just a movie star. He is the landlord of this building. He is the reason this restaurant exists. He ate in the kitchen with the staff last week just to thank them for their hard work. He is the kindest, most humble man you will ever meet. And you treated him like trash. The waiter felt tears stinging his eyes. He quickly looked down at his shoes. I didn't know, he stammered. He looked. I thought. You thought you could judge him by his clothes, she said sharply. You thought because he wasn't wearing a suit, he didn't matter. That is exactly what is wrong with you. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I went out there to tell him you were fired, she said. I told him we have zero tolerance for that kind of behavior. I told him you were gone. The waiter let out a long, shaky breath. It was over. His career was ruined because of his arrogance. But, the manager continued, pausing for a long moment, he wouldn't let me do it. The waiter's head snapped up. What? He stopped me, she said, a look of wonder in her eyes. He said, don't fire him. He's just having a bad day. We've all had bad days. Just tell him to be kind to the next guy. The room felt like it was spinning. The waiter couldn't believe it. The man he had insulted, the man he had mocked for being poor, the man he had told to leave. That man had just saved his job. The actor hadn't asked for an apology. He hadn't demanded he be thrown out. He had shown him mercy. The waiter reached into his apron pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills the guest had left. It was maybe $15? He looked at the money with disgust now. It felt dirty. It felt like a weight he couldn't carry. He left a tip, the waiter said, his voice barely audible. Even after I yelled at him, he left money. Keep it, the manager said softly. Every time you look at it, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember that you judged a book by its cover, and you were completely wrong. You're not firing me? He asked, confused. No, she said, crossing her arms. Mr. Reeves insisted you stay. But you are not working on the floor tonight. I'm taking you off the schedule for the weekend. When you come back, you're starting in the back. You're going to be peeling potatoes and polishing silverware until you learn some humility. You need to earn back the right to talk to our guests. It was a heavy punishment, but it was fair. It was better than being unemployed. But the waiter knew the real punishment wasn't the schedule change. The real punishment was the guilt sitting in his chest. He realized that while he was busy trying to act important, the truly important person was the one showing grace. Go, the manager said, nodding toward the kitchen. Go get your things and go home. And say a silent thank you to that man. The waiter walked toward the kitchen, his legs feeling heavy. Just before he pushed through the swinging doors, he looked out the window one last time. Keanu Reeves was still outside. He was laughing now, talking to one of the camera crew members. He looked completely at peace, as if the terrible interaction inside hadn't even happened. He wasn't holding a grudge. He wasn't angry. He was just living his life. The watcher watched him for a long moment. He realized that true class wasn't about wearing a tuxedo or knowing which wine to order. True class was about how you treated people who could do absolutely nothing for you. And tonight, the waiter had failed that test. While the man in the hoodie had passed with flying colors, he walked into the kitchen, hung up his apron, and clocked out. He walked out into the cool night air through the back alley, taking a deep breath. He didn't lose his job, but he knew he had lost something more important, his ego. And as he walked toward the subway station, he promised himself that he would never look down on anyone ever again. He would treat the next person who walked through the door like they were the most important person in the world, because you never really know who is sitting on the other side of the table.